Critique of Practical Reason by Immanuel Kant. Translated by Thomas Kingsmill Abbott. Read by Michael Luntz for Ukemi Audiobooks. Preface. This work is called The Critique of Practical Reason, not of the pure practical reason, although its parallelism with the speculative critique would seem to require the latter term. The reason of this appears sufficiently from the treatise itself. Its business is to show that there is pure practical reason, and for this purpose it criticizes the entire practical faculty of reason. If it succeeds in this, it has no need to criticize the pure faculty itself in order to see whether reason, in making such a claim, does not presumptuously overstep itself, as is the case with the speculative reason. For if, as pure reason, it is actually practical, it proves its own reality, and that of its concepts, by fact, and all disputation against the possibility of its being real is futile. With this faculty, transcendental freedom is also established. Freedom, namely, in that absolute sense in which speculative reason required it in its use of the concept of causality in order to escape the antinomy into which it inevitably falls, when in the chain of cause and effect it tries to think the unconditioned. Speculative reason could only exhibit this concept of freedom problematically as not impossible to thought without assuring it any objective reality, and merely lest the supposed impossibility of what it must at least allow to be thinkable should endanger its very being and plunge it into an abyss of skepticism. Inasmuch as the reality of the concept of freedom is proved by an apodeictic law of practical reason, it is the keystone of the whole system of pure reason, even the speculative, and all other concepts, those of God and immortality, which, as being mere ideas, remain in it unsupported, now attach themselves to this concept, and by it obtain consistence and objective reality. That is to say, their possibility is proved by the fact that freedom actually exists, for this idea is revealed by the moral law. Freedom, however, is the only one of all the ideas of the speculative reason of which we know the possibility a priori, without, however, understanding it, because it is the condition of the moral law which we know. Footnote. Lest anyone should imagine that he finds an inconsistency here when I call freedom the condition of the moral law, and hereafter maintain in the treatise itself that the moral law is the condition under which we can first become conscious of freedom, I will merely remark that freedom is the ratio essendi of the moral law, while the moral law is the ratio cognoscendi of freedom. For had not the moral law been previously distinctly thought in our reason, we should never consider ourselves justified in assuming such a thing as freedom, although it be not contradictory. But were there no freedom, it would be impossible to trace the moral law in ourselves at all. End of footnote. The ideas of God and immortality, however, are not conditions of the moral law, but only conditions of the necessary object of a will determined by this law. That is to say, conditions of the practical use of our pure reason. Hence, with respect to these ideas, we cannot affirm that we know and understand, I will not say the actuality, but even the possibility of them. However, they are the conditions of the application of the morally determined will to its object, which is given to it a priori, viz., the summum bonum. Consequently, in this practical point of view, their possibility must be assumed, although we cannot theoretically know and understand it. To justify this assumption, it is sufficient, in a practical point of view, that they contain no intrinsic impossibility, contradiction. Here we have what, as far as speculative reason is concerned, is a merely subjective principle of assent, which, however, is objectively valid for a reason equally pure but practical, and this principle, by means of the concept of freedom, assures objective reality and authority to the ideas of God and immortality. Nay, there is a subjective necessity, a need of pure reason, to assume them. Nevertheless, the theoretical knowledge of reason is not hereby enlarged, but only the possibility is given, which heretofore was merely a problem and now becomes assertion, and thus the practical use of reason is connected with the elements of theoretical reason. And this need is not a merely hypothetical one for the arbitrary purposes of speculation, that we must assume something if we wish in speculation to carry reason to its utmost limits, but it is a need which has the force of law to assume something without which that cannot be, which we must inevitably set before us as the aim of our action.